Hi guys, I have had lots of requests recently from you asking me if I could begin filming seasonal classics recommendations videos. So you asked and I am here answering. This is my spring classics recommendations. I'm going to start with a book that I am currently reading and think is perfect for spring. This is The Enchanted April by Elizabeth von Arnim. Even the title screams spring. This is about 4 women from different walks of life who join together to rent a small Italian castle during April, and it was published in 1922. Elizabeth von Arnim was an incredibly popular author during this time. She wrote a lot of books. Others include Elizabeth and Her German Garden, which is on my TBR pile, and I am loving this. I'm particularly enjoying having 4 very different women joining together, in many ways escaping domestic life, and I think the book interestingly looks at women's domestic lives and how that differs to the lives of men and kind of the roles that women have, so that when they then go and escape that in itself is commentary on the roles that women are kind of said to have. They don't really have a choice in it. This is the Vintage Classics edition, one of the ones with the red spines, and it has an introduction written by Brenda Bowen, and I really love it, so I'd like to read you the first part of it. So it begins like this. Open a window, or better, wander into a garden. Find a chaise, settle down, breathe in the scent, whatever it is, but breathe especially deep if there's wisteria in the air. Put on a hat, or at least some sunscreen. Turn off your phone. Now you're ready to read Elizabeth von Arnim's The Enchanted April. And this book does have a certain sense of wonder around it, something you want to kind of luxuriate in. I am loving this, and I think that all of you will too. Next up for my spring classics recommendations, and I am returning to an old favourite. This is Agnes Gray by Anne Bronte, one of the first classics that I ever read, and it certainly set the tone for the rest of my classics readings. The reason that I would like to recommend this to you is that this year is Anne Bronte's bicentenary year. This year Anne Bronte turns 200, and Agnes Gray was her first published novel. It often gets overshadowed by the other Bronte books, and also by Anne's other book, The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, which is certainly the most powerful of the two. But the reason that I think that Agnes Gray is a perfect spring recommendation is that there is something very quiet about it. I find that the books that I enjoy reading in spring are the quieter books that focus on smaller things, books that you can luxuriate in and spend the time getting the most out of, and Agnes Gray is one of those books. If you like Jane Eyre, then I think you'll also like this because there are many similarities between the two. Agnes Gray also follows a governess, in this case Agnes Gray, and she is looking after unruly children in the families of wealthy people, whereas Jane Eyre focuses on one family, Mr. Rochester and his ward Adele. Agnes Gray follows a few different families that Agnes visits, and it also has one of the best romances. I would love for this one day to be turned into an adaptation, basically so that I get to see the final scene on screen, because I think that it would just be the best thing that ever happened. And Anne Bronte has a strong sense of morals and moral guidance within the book that I find is particularly important to focus on as you are reading it and think that you'll get a lot out of. So I think that Agnes Gray will be a book that I will be rereading this spring so that I can celebrate Anne in all her glory. Next we turn to some poetry, and I don't think there is any better spring poet than William Wordsworth. This is my edition. This is the Faber Nature Poets edition with poems selected by fellow poet Seamus Heaney, and I have been working my way through this. this. William Wordsworth is one of the most iconic British poets, and his understanding of nature is second to none. He was pioneering at the time for the way that he viewed poetry and the way that he formed his poems in the romantic style. He really was one of the founding fathers of English romanticism. And so when you read this, you're not only reading the poems, but you're also reading something that would change the face of literature. Here, in fact, is a poem called Lines Written in Early Spring, which begins, "I heard 1,000 blended notes while in a grove I sate reclined, in that sweet mood when pleasant thoughts bring sad thoughts to the mind. To her fair works did nature link the human soul that through me ran, and much it grieved my heart to think what man has made of man. Through primrose tufts in that green bower the periwinkle trailed its wreaths, and 'tis my faith that every flower enjoys the air it breathes. The birds around me hopped and played, their thoughts I cannot measure, but the least motion which they made, it seemed a thrill of pleasure." There are two other stanzas which I will leave it to you to seek out for yourself. That just goes to show how fantastic William Wordsworth was. I haven't read much of his poetry, so I'm really looking forward to discovering more of it. Following on from Wordsworth, I think that this time of year is the best time to seek out nature writing, and one of my favourite nature writers is W.H. Hudson, and he wrote A Shepherd's Life, which is one of my favourite pieces of nature writing, and I loved this when I read it a few years ago. It follows Caleb Borkham, who is a farmer on the plains of Salisbury in Wiltshire, so I loved reading about my home county of Wiltshire. It is about sheep farming, but it is also about the landscape and also about country practices at this time. Not only do you have Caleb, who is kind of our main focus in the book, you also have lots of other people who are mentioned and stories that are told, and really it is a story about generations and things are passed down from generation to generation and things that have changed and are changing. It is a celebration of rural life, and it's a book that I'd love to see more people talk about. I'm hoping to read some more of W.H. Hudson's books in the future. I downloaded a few onto my Kindle and I own a few others too, so I love him as a nature writer and also as a presence during the latter half of the 19th century. He was incredibly influential and played a huge part in making sure that everybody could enjoy the landscape for many, many years to come. Similar to the Enchanted April, we have A Room with a View by E.M. Forster. This is about a young woman called Lucy Honeychurch who is on holiday in Italy. I find it kind of bittersweet to read books like this at the moment because our own travel is very limited. But the wonderful thing is that you can escape into a book and let your imagination take you to all the places you might not be able to go. The first part of the book is written when Lucy is in Italy and talks about the characters she meets while she is there and the experiences she has, but then the remainder of the book follows the characters as they return to England and their everyday lives, and also sees how they all fit together and how once you take them away from one setting, how does that then work? How does their dynamic change? It's about class and class differences, and I would say that if you have read this but haven't read Howard's End, you might like to substitute this for Howard's End because I love both books. In fact, I love this even more since reading Howard's End, and one of the things I'm going to be doing is watching the adaptation, which I'm so excited to do. I'm going to watch the film and I think it's going to be perfect. So I won't be rereading it this spring, but I'm going to be revisiting it in other forms. And then the final recommendation I have for you is Shakespeare's sonnets. I wanted to include poetry as well as novels during this video because I think that there is something nice about dipping in and out of poetry, and I would like to read some more of Shakespeare's sonnets. I've read a few of them, I have some favourites. My favourite is Sonnet 116, "Let me not the marriage of true minds admit impediments," because I studied it a lot both when I was doing my GCSEs and then A-levels. It's just a poem that kept cropping up. I love sonnets as a form and how a rigid structure can tell you so much and can lead you in so many different directions. For me, my poetic tastes go to these kind of rigid structures, things like sonnets and villanelles and other kinds of structures that are prescribed. I prefer that to kind of free verse, which I don't always get along well with. But no matter what poetry you are reading at this time of year, I hope that you'll get something out of it. I will be filming a video soon on how to read poetry with my advice on how you can get the most out of the poems you read. But I will say that if you are slightly hesitant to read poetry, the best thing you can do is just dive in and give it a go. You might not understand everything at first, but the more you read of it, the better you will get at reading it and understanding it. So that's my advice before I film that video. Shakespeare is the best of the best. I love him and his poetry is just simply amazing. So those were my spring classics recommendations. If you are new to my channel, then I have many other videos recommending classics that you can go and watch. And I'm also hosting my own classics reading challenge this year called #ClassicsCommunity, where we are trying to read as many classics as we can over the course of the year. So I really hope you enjoyed this video and I would love to know your classics recommendations for spring in the comments. Happy reading!